welcome to the People's History of Horror. I am your host, Aaron,
And I'm Mike.
and today we're going to be talking about horror for kids. So, this is one of our specific book related podcasts. So, here at the beginning, I just want to reiterate a point that we've made before that we fucking love horror, and it's kind of the reason we're here discussing this today in the first place. It's a big part of kind of like who we are in a weird way, I would say. So that's our confession of bias when it comes to horror for kids. Like, we're going to try to figure out where that line is between horror for kids and just horror.
Yeah, I got to say, this was kind of a struggle because we grew up watching, we watched slashers and stuff from the 80s as kids. So, like, one of my favorite movies as a kid was The Exorcist. That line wasn't there in our childhood. So now that I have nieces and nephews, like, it's kind of helped me to figure out the line. So we had to kind of straddle that for this episode, and we'll see if y'all agree with us or not.
This is like, because when I was a kid, the age range that we're trying to discuss today, like, I was into the stranger, weirder stories and the darker tales and like we discussed earlier, and it'll come up here in a minute, like even the fairy tales and the urban legends that kids kind of crop up with anyways can get pretty horrific. But like when I was 12 and I told someone I like Stephen King or Clive Barker, like that was seen as, I guess, a bit too much and kind of weird for a kid to be so into.
Borderline taboo.
Yeah. So we started horror pretty early, and not just like we said with Goosebumps and Gremlins and scary stories to tell in the dark and stuff, but with actual like Tales from the Crypt. I said Pumpkinhead earlier, and you thought I was talking about kids horror, and you're like, that's not.
Yeah.
I was just like, that's what we were into, and so we kind of have to figure out. And that's one of the questions we'll talk about today, is where that line is. But we happen to grow up in a specific period where they did kind of like push horror made for kids onto kids.
We grew up in, there's obviously the bias, but in my opinion, the best era for children's horror. It's gotten a lot softer nowadays, and it's not really that scary. Whereas when we were kids, it scared you. And I don't know, like Slappy, come on, man. Slappy was terrifying.
Yeah. And so, like, one of the things I did want to point out before we started bringing up specifics and everything is in our research, we looked at several other people's opinions about this subject, and one thing that always came up was the Scholastic Book Fair.
Yeah.
And that's because that's pretty much where Goosebumps was kind of birthed.
They had a program that got started where they were trying to push horror for children, and Goosebumps was like the star of that program. There were several other titles.
And then like Fear Street was another thing.
Well, that was actually another R.L. Stein series.
Yeah.
But there were other works other than him. But Goosebumps was the real star there.
Yeah. It was also around the same era as things like Are You Afraid of the Dark? And just they did the Goosebumps show, which I'm sure we'll dig into pretty
We'll
good.
get into Goosebumps pretty well here in a minute.
But it was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark that just kind of came out of nowhere and kind of set the tone for that, I guess, subgenre of horror. And that is kind of when they realized, well, we can do something like Goosebumps. And so Goosebumps kind of appeared. But I do kind of want to highlight Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, because everywhere I looked, it does seem to be like the first, like, we're going to scare the crap out of kids.
Yeah.
That was like the first real attempt at that.
So Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark came out in the 80s. I don't remember what year.
I think it was like 86, 87.
Something like that. But it was a series of three collections of short stories. They were Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Oh, I actually have it written down. That came out in 81.
Oh, really?
More Stories to Tell in the Dark, which came out in 84. And then Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones, in 91. They were written by Alvin Schwartz. They were like 10 cents. That was my first horror book. Like, it was the very first one I owned. I bought it for 10 cents at a thrift store, man.
Yeah.
Like, just because I thought the art looked cool.
I mean, yeah, that's really where the spirit of those particular books lies, the artwork.
Shout out Stephen Gamble. Like, he was the artist behind all that. It was pretty dope. And there was a movie adaptation of it. It was in 2019. I haven't seen it, and it looks trash. And I was told it was trash, so I still haven't seen it.
I saw the trailer, and I will say, like, they got the tone of the art and like what they should have done with it, but they kind of fell apart with trying to put all of these different short stories into like one coherent. Like, they should have really stuck to like just do shorts and just stay with the material and don't try to combine stuff, because while a lot of that is, you can do something like they did that with the Goosebumps movie where they combined a bunch of it, but
they wrote a story that made it make sense.
Yeah, and with the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, like, I appreciate them trying to do something with that.
Just make a series.
Yeah, or just make some cool animated shorts or something with the artwork. But whatever. But with the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, that's really where it lives, is just that art style, and I guess it allows you to tell a story that's pretty dark and gritty and can actually, I mean, I know us as children, we were probably
we were exposed to some real scary, gory things.
Yeah, we're probably not the best standard for whether or not that was really scary.
That was one of my first exposures to horror, and it was a good one, because those images still stand with me today.
It's also one of those things where, in my experience, it was almost always one of those books that, like, all your teachers who liked books and had their own little like bookshelf in the classroom,
the private library, it was always in those.
It was always one of them was always in there,
even when it was banned.
Yeah, because I mean, teachers don't really care about that.
No,
I've noticed. But yeah. So with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, it kind of, I guess it showed other publishers and writers that, like, this is something we can do with kids and be successful.
Like horror,
yeah. And so you do get Goosebumps, and that's, like I said, that's also the period where you started getting darker content in just your everyday other regular series, like Rugrats.
Oh,
and just whatever. Like, we mentioned Ren and Stimpy on here a couple of times because while it's not overtly horror content,
the imagery.
Yeah, the imagery in Ren and Stimpy, that style has always interested me, just as an aside, because they do that a lot on, like, SpongeBob, where they, like, zoom in close up to something, and it's just like, what am I looking at? That's creepy. Like, the other shows do it too, but those are the two that I've noticed.
Yeah, they're really good at it.
Yeah. But Ren and Stimpy is obviously is something that would get quote unquote canceled today.
I mean, it got canceled in the 90s.
I mean, yeah.
If it got canceled in the 90s, it damn sure ain't standing up today.
Like, I figure, like, then that was one of the things we had mentioned earlier, and something I would like to keep in mind as we discuss some of this other stuff is that period that we're talking about, the late 80s, early 90s, into the rest of the 90s, I guess, is, I guess the creators realized that it's fun to get kind of dark and creepy with the kids' content. So you got things like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
The ant was terrifying.
Yeah, and like we mentioned with the Christmas episode, Nightmare Before Christmas, like, there's a argument whether or not it's really horror, but there's clearly horror elements. You got the boogeyman and or Oogie Boogie, as he's called in that movie.
Man,
but
even younger, like, I was huge Chitty Chitty Bang Bang fan as a child.
Oh, yeah, the Child Snatcher.
The Child Snatcher, like, that dude gave you nightmares.
Well, we had mentioned that right alongside that would be Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Like, the Oompa Loompas and the boat ride.
Yeah.
Both terrifying.
And the guy that was trying to steal the everlasting gobstopper,
Yeah.
he was kind of creepy. And so yeah, like that kind of thing has always been around, like we mentioned with fairy tale, like the Brothers Grimm. Those stories haven't been so old. Like that's not really the version that we heard at like.
No, we got Disney softened versions, man. And like read the real fairy tales. That shit is dark.
Yeah.
You said Grimm's. Read like Hans Christian Andersen.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, that's speaking of Hans Christian Andersen, I'll slip this in, and it's kind of a hidden element in the Disney movies between The Little Mermaid, Tarzan, and Frozen, and it goes along with the Rapunzel. So Rapunzel is Elsa's cousin.
Oh, I've heard this theory.
And so they have a wedding at the end of Rapunzel, and where the beginning of Tarzan, you see like a boat crash, and this like aristocratic couple or whatever crashes and everything, and the Little Mermaid like sees that boat crash, and like it explores it or whatever, and so
that's where she gets her thingamajig.
Yeah, so that whole connection is basically that's where their parents, that's how their parents died or whatever.
Yeah.
And
and Tarzan's her brother.
Yeah, so that would make Tarzan her brother. But that's a side that has nothing to do with what we're discussing, other than it does connect us to, we wanted to mention the more horrific elements in Disney movies. And I guess the place to start with that is the one that was the most controversial in its time, and is the Black Cauldron, being far too terrifying for children, apparently. But that was also one of my favorites as a kid.
Yeah, I'm sure at some point on a Blunt Talk episode, we'll be talking Disney movies, and you'll find out that Black Cauldron is definitely top 3 for me, and probably you as well.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it was.
The Horned King is terrifying, man.
It was a pretty terrifying movie through and through. Wonderful movie, but yeah,
and there's multiple examples from Disney movies we can mention, like the donkey scene in Pinocchio always freaked me out as a kid.
The elephants in Dumbo.
Oh,
as an adult,
elephant.
it's like, hey, that's trippy, that's great. But as
when
a
you're
kid,
just a little
that's
7-year-old
terrifying.
sitting down and watch Dumbo, it is pretty creepy.
Roger Rabbit, man. Roger Rabbit has some terrifying scenes.
Yeah, and so obviously we can sit here and just list off movies that aren't horror that have some horrific elements, but
I got something to bring up real quick though.
all right.
What's up with owls being the villains in several children's films?
Yeah, we were talking about Secret of Nim earlier and how the owl is terrifying, and that's just another example of horror in just animated movies made for kids. But we realized, well, there's also the owl in Once Upon a Forest, which is an underrated gem, by the way.
And not even ones that have really anything to do with horror, but like Rockadoodle.
Yeah, the owls are the villains.
Owls are the villains.
But I mean, the owls are one of the. It's like a creepy bird, like a raven or a crow. People like, but it's a one that's actually menacing in its own way. Like an owl could actually fuck you up, whereas a crow, like, it's not that bad. Like I could deal with fight some crows off, but an owl comes at you, you're gonna get hurt. Like it's
you're done.
But yeah, that's once again another aside. So we mentioned scary stories to tell in the dark, and let's go to our next pick that we keep almost avoiding, but Goosebumps.
Well, hold on.
Okay,
We'll avoid it a little more.
Okay, where we
So
going?
Goosebumps is great for kids, but aimed for a younger audience was one of my first book series. Was the Bailey School Kids?
Oh yeah, Bailey School Kids.
Because they're aimed for like second graders and up. You know,
Yeah.
like second to fourth grade. Like that's
what's
that's their stride.
Sideways School, or anyway, it's another series. We'll get to that one day.
But it was co-authored by 2 women, Marsha T. Jones and Debbie Dady. I don't know if I said that correctly. They got over 80 books. But they were like, vampires don't wear polka dots. Like, and it was like their teacher was a vampire, you know. Bigfoot done square dance, just random crap
It's
like
like
that. where
the
they
next
met.
step up from the teacher from the Black Lagoon
Yeah,
or the librarian from the Black Lagoon.
yeah. They
and
had all that kind of stuff, and like
those were good.
it was great, man. Like they were a lot of fun, but they were good. They were good for a younger reading level than Goosebumps, like a good start, which led us to Goosebumps.
Yeah. And there's speaking of Goosebumps, there's a story that always comes up when talking about this specific subject and the way that we're talking about it, and that's when R.L. Stine met Stephen King for like the first time. I'm sure they've met up for various dinners at this point, but the first time, R.L. Stine didn't really know how to approach him, so he just told him some stuff that he heard. A lot of people say that I'm like the training wheels for you.
And King had the best response.
Yeah, he was like, yes, I know.
Like, he's like, yeah, facts.
Yeah, I get it. And that is like we're two examples of specifically that of people who cut our teeth on some Goosebumps and
It's
ended
true.
up being King fanatics. And so, tell me some stuff about Goosebumps, Mike.
All right. Well, as you mentioned, R.L. Stine was the author.
Yeah.
Well, so there are 62 books in the actual Goosebumps series, which ran from 92 to 97. However, that spans several spin-off series,
Yeah.
which there's over 240 books total in all the series. Some of the spin-offs were Give Yourself Goosebumps, Goosebumps Horrorland, Goosebumps Slappy World, and Goosebumps Gold, which was never released.
Curious.
I only mentioned the ones I read and enjoyed. There were several others. Those were the
Yeah.
ones that I could think of
The-
because I wasn't looking them all up.
The ones I remember is like the Give Yourself Goosebumps and the Horrorland are kind of like the choose your own adventure style of stories, which that's another thing that kind of took off hard right around the same time as like the choose your own adventure books.
Yeah, it was a neat concept that was different. Now it's like, that's
kinda
kind of
hard to
lame.
pull off, yeah.
But back then it was cool. It was different. We've already discussed this note I got that it was published by the Scholastic Corporation in an attempt to push horror books for kids.
Yeah,
It was
like-
like I said,
that's-
the star. But it spanned TV series, video games, comics, movies. Like Goosebumps, like changed everything. It's all over the place now. Everyone knows it.
I mean, we'll get to it in a minute. Obviously, we mentioned the TV show Goosebumps, and I guess that was more because I already had a taste for stuff like, like I said, Tales from the Crypt and Twilight Zone and that kind of story. Like Goosebumps is literally just that. As far as the TV show is concerned, it's literally just Twilight Zone for kids.
Yeah, and actually, one of the book series that they ran, the spinoffs, was just a re-release of all the books that were the episodes.
The episode,
of the
yeah.
TV series.
But I mean, I remember like by 6th grade, I had read every Goosebumps that I could get my hands on.
Yeah,
And I know,
same.
like in 6th grade, they started doing like the accelerated reading program where they was trying to get you to gain points for every book. Goosebumps was easy for that because you could get like 5 of them and read them in that one day, and now you got all the. And so that was a method of mine, is just read all the Goosebumps, and because I already liked and enjoyed them. And like we said, with the thing I like about Goosebumps is it's not really putting the kids that are the characters in danger in the way that like a slasher that we would appreciate would.
No, like no harm really ever comes to the characters.
And if they did, it was always fixed.
It was something minor, and like the end kind of resolved it. But it was just creepy and terrifying situation. But it just kind of showed kids like, hey, you're gonna have terrifying situations, and it's okay. You know.
And I mean, it helped. It lets you deal with certain real world problems and fears, and emotional states that a kid might go through, and that's really what horror is. Is it even for adults, it allows you to play with the darker things in life in a safe and comfortable way, where I mean, yeah, like sometimes it might, if the story is really effective, it might stick with you and that be a thing for you for the rest of your life. But Goosebumps specifically avoids that, but will play with every other thing. And so, one of the books that I remember specifically from Goosebumps, I forget the exact title, but it was the like Out of the Cuckoo Clock, where the girl like accidentally wishes her brother didn't exist, and then
Yeah.
like her brother didn't exist.
Yeah.
That's probably the closest I've ever seen to like a kid dying in a Goosebumps book. Obviously, she was eventually able to like reverse that, but that's the one time I can remember that like, oh,
Like,
that's actually some real hardcore danger.
I'd say the Say Cheese and Die books were like,
That was a similar.
because it's not that, oh, they died. It's like, where the fuck did they go?
Yeah,
Like, what do you, they're in
What
this
is
picture.
happening?
How do I fix that?
yeah. And so there are the stronger books that we can name. Obviously, Slappy,
Night of
The
the
Night of the
Living
Living Dummy, and I think there was like 5 or 6 of those.
Like, so on not just the books but the series, like those easily the two most memorable episodes were Night of the Living Dummy, which it's funny, the episode they went with was Night of the Living Dummy 2. They didn't even do the first book.
Yeah, because it's
The second one was way more terrifying though.
well, the first one is almost more of a setup with like a scare at the very end,
Yeah,
and that's kind of
it's a
hard.
creepy vibe through the whole thing.
Yeah, it's hard to
He
pull
doesn't
off.
really do much.
But with the second one, like he's going all out. So
But the second one I got, like the most memorable, was The Revenge of the Garden Gnomes. They made garden gnomes creepy.
they were some terrifying looking garden gnomes, and I feel like anyone who actually like knows me knows me. Like I got a little gnome collection, and gnomes is
He's got
kind
a
of
gnome fetish.
yeah, gnomes is me and Laura like decorate with gnomes and stuff. So I've always had an appreciation. I have characters in my own stories that are gnomes, and I don't know if maybe Goosebumps is the reason because like I like horror, and so that episode's always kind of stuck with me. But I don't think it is because those gnomes.
I think it's because you're a hippie.
That's probably the gnomes from Goosebumps is like those are the only time I've seen that design for gnomes, for like even garden gnomes. Like they tend to look somewhat different, like the facial structure
Yeah.
or whatever. And so it works where you can separate those gnomes from the cute gnomes that you like to have. But Goosebumps also does that with other things, like you said, with the dummy. Like I've never seen another dummy like that, a ventriloquist dummy that looks exactly like Slappy, although
There was one.
It was a Dead Silence. Dead
Billy
Silence.
the puppet. Yeah,
yeah,
which is cool. Go
it's
back and
probably
watch
directly
that.
referencing to
Go back and
Slappy.
watch that and like slow mo the scene that pans across all the puppets on the wall. You're gonna see a Pennywise puppet. You're gonna see Jigsaw. Like there's like 2 or 3 nods. I think there's a Chucky doll in there. Like there's several nods that like you got to be quick because you know they didn't want to get sued.
Speaking of dolls, and you said Pennywise, and so one thing I do want to mention is our conversation earlier about clowns, and discussing like where our fear of clowns might have come from, and everyone always points back to Stephen King's It and Pennywise and everything, but we figured out the real source, and that's Killer Clowns from Outer Space, which is almost a kids movie. It has certain feelings of a kids movie, but it's definitely not for kids.
It's one that my parents were definitely like, oh yeah, you can watch that when I was a kid for sure, because they were like,
It's
that,
clowns.
that can't be bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was way more terrifying. Like, because with Pennywise, to me, he didn't bring out a fear of clowns. It was, I watched the series, the miniseries, before I read the books, and you know I've read the books a lot.
Yeah.
The book,
The book
but
feels like multiple books.
yeah, right. But to me, it made it even as a child, it made it pretty clear that he's not a clown. he's this entity that can take form of whatever you're afraid of. You see him as a werewolf.
He
You
takes
see him
the-
as a spider, as this giant monster. Like
He takes
he's
the form
not
of a clown to be
a
more.
clown. Yeah, he does that to sneak in, so that he doesn't make me like he didn't make me afraid of clowns. It was just like no, it makes
Made
me
me
afraid
afraid
of
of that
him.
clown.
Yeah. Whereas Killer Clowns from Outer Space, it's like they did legit clown shit. Like they used cotton candy rays on you, bro.
Yeah. And
They was clowning.
the thing I appreciate the most about Killer Clowns from Outer Space is that each of the clowns were distinct, and like they had their own form and their own style and design.
Yeah.
And you knew which one you were looking at when you were looking at one.
And they
of them.
fucked with you in their own way.
Exactly. And so, like we got off on Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I brought that up specifically because when I was a kid, we were poor. We didn't have cable. So a lot of the movies that we got to see were like the Saturday ones that just came on all day during the day on like your regular network's channels.
We got Killer Clowns and Night of the Comet on
yeah,
repeat.
Yeah, and that was one that was always there. And so for me, like it is another one of those kids movies that I watched, and I think of it as a kids movie because I was like 9 and 10 when I first saw that, and
But realistically, it's not horror for
it's
kids.
definitely not horror for kids. And so that like we were trying to like kind of figure out like where that line is, and for me, like Bunnicula is a book. It was another one of those books that was always in like your teacher's little personal library.
Yeah.
And so like I read that one pretty young, and while it's
I was in like first grade when I read that one.
the way it's written as if you're supposed to like take this seriously as like just another Dracula.
But it's a bunny.
But it's a bunny, and it sucks the juices out of vegetables and like leaves them a ghostly white thing. So that alone is creepy. Like the whole essence of Bunnicula by itself
But he's
is
a bunny being a good boy.
yeah, it is creepy. And so to me that like that's probably the essence of horror for kids is you can take serious elements like Goosebumps do and form a story around like this kid's parents are getting divorced, and so he picks up a new hobby, and that hobby ends up being a terrifying murderous doll, you know. Bunnicula, it has that essence where it takes something like in other contexts it would be creepy, but it's a safe form of creepy, and I guess that's where the horror for kids comes in, is like the safety element of like you yourself will probably never have to deal with something like this, but we're gonna help you deal with some other emotion through this absurd situation where your dad accidentally invents plant,
Yeah.
monsters or whatever.
So I've heard a lot of people, like a lot of friends with kids, like talk about their line for horror for kids is kind of like, does it make you feel endangered? Like, do you ever feel like there's any real danger in it? If so, it's too much. I disagree, because I feel like there's a lot of things that make you feel a sense of danger. So I probably am going too far with this, to be honest, but my line with like my nieces and nephews, because this was kind of the line I grew up with, is this going to scare you to the point where you're going to start crying? And I know that's a, person to person thing.
I mean,
but
that's probably
I have
how
to
you would have
just
to deal
know
with
that
it.
line with them,
Yeah.
If it is, you ain't watching it. If it's not, you can give it a go. But the thing is, like, the oldest one, he wanted to watch the Leprechaun movie, so I gave him those to watch. Well, the youngest one was like, "Oh, a movie about Leprechaun, awesome!" and went in there to watch it. 20 minutes later, he comes out of that room and is like, "I thought it was a nice Leprechaun. It's not. I don't want to watch it." He gets it. He knows, no, that's too much, and he got out of there.
Yeah.
So
Maybe it'd be something he could look forward to watching later.
yeah,
But I mean, like back to the period that we're talking about, like another one that I want to bring up is Casper, because like before that movie, Casper was the character from
the comics,
the comic
the little
books.
cartoon.
Yeah, and he was more of just like your run of the mill cartoon character, have fun. Like there's
was your
witches
friendly
and
ghost.
goblins. He is a friendly ghost. But that movie, because of I guess the way that they were telling in the period where every movie is a family friendly fun movie.
Her
Like,
family was not friendly.
well, no, you have. I'm just saying, like the time period you had like Homeward Bound and Jumanji and all of these, wholesome fun movies, and then Casper comes out and it's like it takes that and it takes the quirky comedy of that period for that kind of movie, like say Heavyweights or something. I'm just naming various movies to get that feel out of it. And at the heart of that movie, it puts this kid died a terrible, horrific death.
And the climax is the ant driving off a fucking cliff and dying.
And so that's the reason I bring that up is Casper is one of those where you can introduce really serious horror to kids through that family-friendly Steven Spielberg style, haha, we're having fun kind of movie. The Goonies is another example of that, where there's some like actual dark ass shit that's never really touched on all that much.
Honestly,
but it sits at the heart of the story.
Casper kept it going. The sequel, Casper Meets Wendy, where you got Hilary Duff playing the witch.
That is true. Like
the dudes after her, like that was some creepy shit, man.
And so, one of the things that I have found, and I was gonna bring up one that we haven't really touched on because you had mentioned you hadn't really seen it, is Coraline.
Yeah,
Coraline is really great animation style for the time. It kind of, and this would be like the early 2000s, mid 2000s ish period.
Came out with like, I always clump it in with like Paranorman, Frankenweenie.
Yeah, like that,
like
when
Monster
that stuff was
House,
happening.
and like Monster House was so great. I was like, that's the one I want.
Yeah,
so
Monster
that's the
House.
one I'll watch.
Out of those, and I would put Coraline next to it because it deals with where Monster House deals with like, loneliness and frustrations as a kid, and then being afraid of old people and stuff like that. Coraline takes it to a more the strife between a parent and a child, and the little personal struggles children go through dealing with their parents, and what if you wanted a new parent and everything. And so Coraline deals with that, and then obviously you get the monster of the other mother, and she goes to this other world and everything. I don't want to spoil the story, but the essence of it is it allows a kid to take that fantasy of like changing your parents or not wanting your current parents anymore or whatever problem that you're having with them, and turning it around. I'm like, well, it could be fucking worse. And like it could be horrifyingly worse in multiple different ways. And so go ahead and appreciate your parents now. There's not a lot of ways to tell that story and deal with that thing for a kid and it actually be something, one, worth watching, and two, actually wholesome and what a parent would appreciate out of it. And so Neil Gaiman wrote the book Coraline, where he did just that, and then they made the movie. And it's one of the few examples of like the perfect book for that story and the perfect movie for that story. Like it's hard to achieve that. But he uses a quote in that kind of does touch on what we're talking about today, and that's by G.K. Chesterton. Fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that the dragon can be defeated. And so that's really where it comes down to what's appropriate for kids. Is if you can show in the story that like maybe all of this horrible stuff did happen, but we can overcome, we can deal with that, we can get past that.
Which I feel like that's the real gist of horror for kids is that here's a terrible situation, but you can overcome it. That's the story behind it. That's why Goosebumps, that's the story behind all that. That's why those are great. That's why Coraline's great. That's why several of the movies we've mentioned are great. But that's why some of the cartoons we grew up on are great. Like, of course, there was awesome stuff like All Real Monsters, but let's talk about the two biggest ones though. Courage the Cowardly Dog, which is also, in my opinion, kind of the end of horror for kids. But let's go to the beginning of it. Scooby Doo. How do you talk horror for kids and not bring up Scooby Doo?
Scooby Dooby Doo.
Both of those series are great examples of here's something terrifying that you're going to overcome.
Yep. And they, ironically, they also have a couple of cowardly dogs.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, just a fun distinction between, like, Courage, the cowardly dog, where he's afraid and he knows he's afraid, but he still does super brave shit. Whereas Scooby-Doo acts hard at first, and then he's like, "Nah, I'm afraid," and he just is afraid. So that's fun. But we'll start with Scooby-Doo. Like, obviously, Scooby-Doo is not of our era in the sense where, you know, it started long before we were around.
Scooby-Doo is of everyone's era because they won't quit revamping it.
Yeah. But the era we did, you know, we got the movies with Zombie Island and The Witch's Ghost, and like those are the two that I always go to because they're the best ones.
They're the best ones, and like they got, I mean, come on, they started the love for the goth girls, man. The Hex
Girls, yeah, that's true.
But they had so many good ones. The Alien Invasion was a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, it was more adventure-y than
but of course, with the essence of Scooby-Doo really just lies in the episodic adventures, and that didn't so much like teach children that the monsters can be defeated. I think it mostly taught that the real monsters are the adults that won't stop fucking with shit.
yeah, monsters aren't real.
Monsters everyday people. It's just everyday. Whereas Courage goes to the other end of that, where it sticks with the kid. You know, it has the safety. Like, kids they're still safe because each episode of Courage ends with Courage lying in Muriel's lap.
Yeah,
and like, sure, things might be different or weird or forever changed, but it's still cool because, you know, I'm here in Muriel's lap.
Worst case scenario, he's got a few bumps on him sitting in her lap.
Yeah. And so when it comes to Courage, though, that
was some creepy shit, man.
Yeah, there's some real examples of, like, for example, the one episode that comes up a lot when you talk about this, because it is the one episode that might actually leave you not necessarily damaged but marked.
I know exactly where you're going.
Is the creepy, I forget, what is he, like a Bible salesman or something?
No, he cuts
hair.
The hair. Fred.
Yeah. He is genuinely terrifying because but he also represents I mean, he's basically the pedophile, the kitty fondler. Like, that's what's being put up here. And in a weird way, I guess it allows kids to deal with that in a way that's safer, and maybe they can come to, you know, handle it in their real life. But with that episode, that's the one character that's like, please don't come back.
Yeah, no.
Because, I mean, you get the cat, the what's his name?
Cat.
Is his name just Cat?
I think it was just Cats.
Yeah, it's like Cats. Yeah. He shows up in various forms, and sometimes he's bad, sometimes he's not as bad, or sometimes he's never really bad. He's not really the villain in some of the other ways. He's got a scheme.
Yeah.
He's scheming in some way.
He's like a slightly more evil Swiper.
Yeah, basically. He's got some scheme going, and sometimes it's dangerous, sometimes it's harmless, and he's even kind of...
It's just entertaining him.
Yeah. And then obviously there's other ones like I think the chicken, or was it the ducks, the John Lennon ducks?
Oh, yeah. So to me, the two episodes that really stick out for me, though, are one of them fucked me up, kind of. The only one that ever did was between this episode of Courage and Arachnophobia, taking baths and showers was terrifying because of spiders. Because I was always like, in this episode, I remember Muriel being in the bath and just spiders coming out of the drain while she wasn't paying attention and just dropping in. And between that and like the girl showering and Arachnophobia and it dropping down on her, like, yeah, bath time, spiders were terrifying growing up. The other episode that sticks with me wasn't even terrifying. It was just, I loved Eustace. And
Stupid dog.
The episode where he's got the slab and dude's just like, return the slab. And
What's
dude's
your
just
offer?
What's your offer? Like, oh, I love it, bro.
I think
Didn't give a shit how bad things were getting. He was just like, nah, let me get some bread.
The one that sticks with me, and it's because the one time that I actually actively hated Muriel is when she got like turned into the 4-year-old or whatever.
Oh, she was
so
annoying.
fucking annoying.
Yes, young Muriel. Yeah.
But with Courage, the Cowardly Dog, like I think it holds a position in history, and even just in horror history specifically, as like you said, as the last great hurrah of children's horror, and that may or may not be true, but it does hold the spot for pushing the envelope the furthest when it comes to surrealist, creepy, crazy imagery being thrown at kids, specifically in that way, with very little payoff when it comes to plot or whatever.
Yeah.
Because in other things, like we mentioned, Ren and Stimpy, or even Ed, Edd n Eddy, there's some surrealist, crazy imagery in that. But there's always some other goal that's eventually reached. But with Courage, it's just like, here's a bunch of crazy shit. Do with it what you want. Like it's,
yeah.
And it might not ever be mentioned or come up again. Like there's some stuff that returns and sticks around as like a constant, but most of the craziness, it just happens, you deal with it, and then it's gone, and that's it. And that's all while like being funny, being quirky, telling a fun story. But then it also like, and I didn't notice like Courage in the first like part of the series, like he actually talked, like he had like whole sentences.
He talks a lot more.
And then like I guess they eventually settled on like some.
It was cheaper to not have the voice actor.
Blah, 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 but then like certain words to like I guess it was easier to do it that way. But I think the reason that they did it that way is because it's easier to have Courage not be able to get across his point at all times.
Yeah.
You know, it basically adds another obstacle to him. But what I did notice is the moments, even back when he like would use full sentences, the moments where they had him talk, they always made it matter. Where either he said some funny ass shit, a good joke,
Yeah,
or like he basically threw forth the moral of this week's episode in a fun way that a kid can understand. And so like I've seen them, insult politicians.
he pulled the Kyle from South Park.
Do what?
He pulled a Kyle from South Park.
Yeah, basically. not necessarily to that extent. But
in essence.
Speaking of South Park, let us not forget, like we mentioned before, that just the everyday average TV show and Disney and all of these had horror.
All of the adult animation shows that we watched as children had great, like, mostly Halloween episodes. I mean,
Yeah.
South Parks were all great. King of the Hill was great. But let's be real. Top dog on that's got to be Simpsons, the Treehouse
of Horror. Yeah, like I said, I feel like people call those adult animations, but because the period where they grew and became the strongest was the 90s, when kids were already watching edgier stuff.
Yeah.
Like there isn't a huge difference between something like Ren and Stimpy and something like South Park, other than just overt language.
Oh, no, there's
use.
not at all. It's just That's what it's under if I go to the genres on any of my apps. So that's what I
Yeah.
call it, to be honest.
And so, one thing I did want to mention, like we mentioned, Monster House being probably the best of that genre or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There's one they made a movie of it more recently, but I have the book and I read it, and it was actually quite moving with a kid basically dealing with the death of a parent. It's called A Monster Calls. I don't know, like I know Liam Neeson voiced the monster in the movie or whatever, but that book it deals with super dark emotions and feelings that a kid might have, being rebellious and hating their parents and
Yeah.
being mad at their parents and so on and so forth. In a way, like at one point, like he destroys his entire house basically, just throwing a fit because he found out his mom died. And like it's moving in a way where it allows you to be the angry kid and to feel those feelings while also being comforted, and it's got cool artwork and everything throughout. And it's never preachy. And I know that as a kid, I hated that kind of thing where it's
Yeah.
like you're trying to give me a moral and a
Yep.
story, but you're being super preachy about it. Can you just tell me the fucking story? Well, Patrick Ness in A Monster Calls, he very much just tells you the story, and he just allows the things to happen and the kid to deal with it. And there's never a point where he's like set down and someone, gives him a talking to and straightens him out. Like, no, he just is allowed to feel his emotions and feel it out for himself and figure out the proper response for himself. Because this monster like helps him create a mess and then helps him clean it up and so it has that safety mechanism while like he's dealing with some actual real shit of his mom died. And so here's some feelings that you might feel if your mom dies, and it lets the kids say some stuff that like you might say about your mom, but you're not going to tell your friend that you said that shit about your mom. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, so I think that's really kind of the best of horror for kids, where it allows, and Goosebumps, once again, I guess Goosebumps is the champion here today.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
Goosebumps did very good job of that, but obviously more toned down and not as overtly depressing as A Monster Calls might be. But I mean, who here can say that they weren't quite depressed by like A Giving Tree, for example? So obviously a couple of other examples we want to mention, like we mentioned
Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Something Wicked This Way Comes.
That was a
Roald-
good start for both of us.
Roald Dahl's The Witches. We mentioned the movie not necessarily being like the top of that list.
It's neither one of our favorites. Neither one of us really care for it that much, but we
appreciate what it
yeah,
is.
there's a respect for it. There's an appreciation. My sister will fight me when she hears this because she loves it. Same with The Labyrinth.
Yeah, it was like
Overrated.
we mentioned Labyrinth being overrated, and
You
I
like
think
David Bowie's junk. You don't like the movie.
yeah, I was gonna say this. It's more of a liking of David Bowie, whereas obviously we mentioned The Dark Crystal being our preference in that
Yeah.
little Jim Henson subgenre. But I mean, he did some. He like Fraggle Rock. Like
How have we not mentioned Hocus Pocus?
yeah, I mean,
it wasn't very scary, but I mean, it was.
I will say that
It had
I'm
moments.
one that was never super into Hocus Pocus, just like I was never super into Labyrinth or that kind of thing.
I know you're not a fan of Beetlejuice either.
Yeah, and then never cared for like it's not like I dislike them. They were just not the ones that I was like, I'm gonna return to that. Like
So I liked those, but for me, around like Halloween and stuff, the horror for kids movies, I was more into. We were big on Little Monsters, the movie
Yeah, I
with
like
Fred
Little
Savage and Howie
Monsters.
Mandel. But other than that, give me the Disney Channel originals, man.
Halloween
give me
Town.
Halloween Town was the best, but like Under Wraps, Can of Worms, Don't Look Under the Bed, those were so great, dude. They were so cheesy, so fun.
And I mean, I would like to mention, for example, We mentioned like the Scholastic Book Fair. Another thing that came up through that caught my attention when I was young was the series of unfortunate events.
Yeah.
And while it's not directly horror related in any way, it did introduce a lot of people to the fantasy genre, which does have a lot of horror elements.
Yeah.
And so, for example, obviously, The Hobbit was originally written as like a children's novel. Obviously, we kind of look at it more as just the prequel to Lord of the Rings, which is a fantasy adult series, and blah blah blah. But those things obviously have a lot of horror elements.
Shelob's Lair.
Yeah, I was gonna say when we hate spiders, there's the Shelob's Lair. But then, of course, the reason I'm bringing that up is because of the period that we're talking about and all the creepy things popping up. Other things eventually just had darker elements and more horrific elements in it. So you got Harry Potter. There's multiple examples, obviously, of horror elements in Harry Potter. And that seeps into various video games. And, I mean, nowadays you have things like Adventure Time. And was it Over the Garden Wall? And that...
What?
You never see Over the Garden Wall?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, well, we'll have to watch it later. Yeah. It's along the same lines as something like, say, Adventure Time or what was the...
You remember Happy Tree Friends?
Oh, yeah, Happy Tree. See, like, that's less, like, scary and just more genuinely creepy. Like, cringy, and then... But, I mean, you mentioned Five Nights at Freddy's, so I was talking...
I didn't, but...
No, we mentioned it earlier. One of the things that I mentioned, because I had asked Laura and John, and I put on Facebook, like, what's something that actually, like, scared you as a kid? Whether it be a book or a movie or, like, a real-life thing. And one of the things that ended up being mentioned are, like, costume characters. So, like... you know, the big bird that comes to your school or something, or like we mentioned Chuck E. Cheese.
Yeah, I knew a lot of kids that were terrified of that stuff.
And I think it does come down to, like, at some point you saw one of these characters take their heads off, and that's just such a surreal thing. So, like, if you thought this was a real person and you saw them take their giant head off and there's another smaller person inside them, that could kind of mess with you psychologically as a kid if you're young enough and just don't understand what's happening.
I got it when people had the fear, but it never occurred to me at all, just because, like, with me and my family, like, I grew up around sports enough to see mascots take it off and stuff that I was just like, oh yeah, it's just some dude in a suit, you know. Since I was a little kid, I knew that. So
I get that, and that was pretty much like I quickly realized because we were doing various volunteering, so like I've seen people put on those suits and everything. But the thing that actually bothered me as a kid is when I realized, like, for example, here's a fun fact of history, like when Chuck E. Cheese first started, like, doing their thing, there was only, like, the one or two that was originally a Chuck E. Cheese, and everything was built and made for that to be a Chuck E. Cheese. All of the other ones were Showtime Pizza. And so, like, Showtime Pizza had, like, the bear and the other different set of characters than the Chuck E. Cheese one. So the little animatronic band thing that they put together, instead of rebuilding them for the Chuck E. Cheese ones, they just stripped all the costumes off the Showtime Pizza ones and put the Chuck E. Cheese ones on there. And so they don't fit exactly right. So and they pull. And they just look even. But I saw that process taking place, and so when you see someone rip a bear head off of a robot like that, that will make you uncomfortable anytime you see that kind of character.
That's a conversation for your therapist, not for the podcast, bro, because that's weird as shit to have to go through seeing that.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, like, that's one of those things, like, as a kid that, like, didn't necessarily make me afraid of those kinds of characters. It just made me wary of them, like, are you a person or are you a robot or are you actually this character?
So you bring up Five Nights at Freddy's, and I have a couple points here I want to make. The first, kind of a side note here, I'm not a fan of Five Nights at Freddy's, so like
Yeah, no, I was never. Been on
everyone's kind of dick riding this movie that just came out. Don't bother. Just watch Willy's Wonderland. It's with Nick Cage. It's terrible and amazing. It's way better. But the real point here that is a good point for this episode, I believe. Video games, horror video games for kids. While I don't like them, I'm an adult, so they're doing their job. My nephews love these games that they're coming out with nowadays. But Five Nights at Freddy's, Hello Neighbor, like there's a lot of things like that that's horror for kids. That's for kids. Whereas we played horror games as kids. We played Resident Evil and other things such as that. They weren't for kids. The first horror game for kids we got was Luigi's Mansion.
Yeah. And I mean,
the other ones were for adults. We just played them. Like, they're actually doing that for kids now, and I love that.
And I guess we're coming closer to an end now. And so, like, one of the things that I will say is, like, I'm not big on video games. I never really have been. Like, there's certain ones that I enjoy. But I feel like a lot of video game, like when it comes to video games, a lot of people see them as just for kids anyways. So it's hard to say that you didn't make this game for a kid because, you know, like even the people who try to rate them, like this is a teen rated game or so on and so, like y'all know damn well, like the most XXX rated video game that y'all make and put out there, whatever it happens to be.
That just means my uncle's buying it for me.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's hard to say like all of them weren't kind of made for like I guess more teens is really where video games are aimed at.
They're made
anyways.
for 12-year-olds.
Yeah. But I mean like certain ones obviously are darker and harder in tone and everything.
They're made for the fucked up 12-year-olds.
Yeah. And so that's kind of how I also feel like adult animation is like, you know, some dumbass parent's going to put on Rick and Morty and not fucking realize that this is not for, you know, 10-year-olds. But then, like, that's just why we grew up appreciating things.
We grew up on South Park, man.
Yeah. And so, but I guess that kind of brings me to one of my final points is like, we didn't necessarily find the line what's proper for kids and everything other than there's got to be some element of safety in it.
I'm sticking with it's situational. It depends on the kid.
Individual
and
kid.
You have to know your kid and know that line for each one.
Yeah. Because, I mean, we didn't mention it much, but like Wizard of Oz.
This is coming from two people with no kids, by the way.
Yeah. Like, don't necessarily take my judgment on raising your kids because I'm going to, you know. Reason I bring up Wizard of Oz is because, like we mentioned, various horrific elements and non-horror things. Can you honestly tell me that anyone would say you wouldn't show a young kid Wizard of Oz?
No.
Or like there's something harmful there?
But since we're talking Wizard of Oz, so first one, there's a couple scenes people could say are kind of scary, like the monkeys like snatching her and kidnapping Dorothy and stuff. You know, it's got its moments, but overall, no, not at all. So when we were kids, I remember my mom, like Return to Oz came on. She was like, "Oh, it's a sequel to Wizard." Okay, yeah, here, put it on for me and my sister Jessica to watch. And we sat down and started watching it when it came on. And she comes in like halfway through the movie. She's like, "What the fuck are y'all watching? Did y'all change it?" And we're just like, "Nah, man. But you put it on." But like, we're invested. Don't turn it off. But no, that shit was creepy, man. The Wheelers.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're getting towards the end of it. We kind of we talked about all the stuff when we were younger. Been talking here lately about things we were into when we were older. So, growing up, you know, my dad was real into like haunted stuff, like you know what I mean. One of the big things was we always watched like Most Haunted Places in America, stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, because of that, there was a show, a Disney Channel show that was called So Weird that me and Jessica watched, and it was like this teen that could like see ghosts and communicate with them and stuff. I think she was like a medium, but her and her friends that like her mom had like a show kind of like Ghost Adventures ish, you know, and they went around to all these places, and like her mom would shoot the show, which I think was supposed to be like a fake show, but I don't remember. But then her and her friends would go back and actually like investigate and help the ghosts and shit. But That was really dope. That was one of my favorites growing up.
Well, I would say like just to throw out a couple of other examples that would be good either introduction to horror for a kid or just have fun with this is Laura really likes the Skullduggery Pleasant books. And while they're more like fantasy adventure, there's like definitely some horror
They're
in
horror
there.
themed.
Yeah. And a couple of other examples would be obviously we mentioned Neil Gaiman's Coraline. He also has it's called the Graveyard Book, and his kids having fun in a graveyard. But is there any that you wanted to throw out there before we wrapped it up?
No, the
As-
only other things were, I guess there's a few things we didn't mention that non-horror things we remember as horrific scenes
Yeah.
would be Brave Little Toaster had a
Oh,
lot of creepy ass
Fern
scenes.
Gully.
Fern Gully, Little Nemo and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, both of those were riddled with terrifying
Yeah.
imagery. But Laura brought this one up. The Page Master.
Oh yeah, the
Like,
Page Master.
Yeah, the Page Master definitely had a lot of creepy ass scenes. I'd really say anything that had Christopher Lloyd in it as a kid, like had something creepy going on.
Well, I mean, it's the Addams Family.
How have we not talked Adam's
I don't
Family,
know,
dude?
It just came.
And I mean Adam's Family, man. So we had the movies with Christina Ricci as a kid, and that was huge. But even before then, like I remember watching the old black and white TV show
Oh, yeah.
reruns, like because granted we watched like that and
was
the
like-
Munsters,
what's the Munsters, yeah.
with my mom all the time. Man, yeah, no, Adam's Family is great. The the new series with Jenny
Yeah,
Ortega,
Wednesday. Yeah,
that's great.
I only watched some of it. I haven't watched all of it yet.
Oh, finish it, dude. It's great.
But I mean, I figure we'll probably do a few episodes on some of the stuff we covered here today. Goosebumps probably deserves a more in-depth analysis, and Scooby Doo. That'd be a fun to do a Scooby Doo episode.
Oh yeah, dude.
But basically, our point here today is that like, while we're not exactly sure where the line may be between horror and horror for kids, I guess it's mostly on intent. Did you make this for kids or not? And then we can discuss whether or not it's appropriate afterwards. But we loved horror as a kid, and like we're only scarred in the ways we're scarred.
Being scared is fun. Not all kids like it, but a lot do. There's a reason that, other than the Lamborghini posters, Goosebumps was like the biggest seller at Scholastic.
Yeah.
Um,
And
That's
I
what
mean,
kids
like,
want.
everyone has their own taste and everything. Some adults aren't really ready for certain elements of horror, anyways, and so it all really does come down to personal taste and individual manner. But I think a little bit of horror for kids is a good thing because, like we said, it does teach them that, like, yeah, some terrible shit might happen to you, but
the world's a scary place, man.
yeah, we can get past it though. And that's really the heart of horror anyways, is dealing with that scary shit in a safer, healthier way. And I think all kids kind of need some of that in their life. So,
Oh, for sure.
but yeah, we'll definitely touch on some more of this here at the People's History of Horror in future. But as of right now, I believe that would be it. So obviously follow us on all of our stuff, share all of our stuff, support us, and be nice about it. But I believe that's it.
Not horror related. Rest in peace, Carl Weathers.
Oh,
Apollo Creed died. That's fucking depressing.
yeah.
But till next time, keep it strange.
Okay, signing off.